Um, Here's the panel. Rich Applebaum, who worked on the rent control issue as a sociology researcher uh, 40 years ago, I guess, wrote a book called Rethinking Rental Housing at that time, became a nationally recognized expert on rent control issues, speaking critically against the argument I just quoted that rent control doesn't work. Found a lot of did a lot of research on that, and Rich is now retired. He's a prominent figure in the faculty at UCSB in the sociology department. Helped found the Global Studies program. Has worked a lot on issues like sweatshops internationally and international issues related to fair trade and so forth. And he's still active now in our community and part of the Housing Coalition, working with the Clergy and Laymen United group, which has been active in lobbying with all of us on the housing question. So Rich Applebaum will lead off, but I want to introduce the whole panel and just have them speak one after the other. We're very I think, honored to have Ryan Bell with us. Ryan is a statewide leader of Tenants Together. He is one of the key initiators in the achievement of rent control recently through a ballot initiative in Pasadena. And I think you're chair of the rent board now. Is that right, Ryan? Um,
I was for the first 2 years, but I was
okay.
recently replaced, but I'm still on the
Okay.
board.
And then we have Anna Arth, who is the a lead organizer in Santa Barbara for Cause. Recently joined the staff of Cause, but she's been working on housing issues for some years before that. And she is really helping push forward the actual rent control campaign in the city. And she will be an important voice on our panel. So each of the panelists we've suggested talk for about 15 minutes, and then there'll be time for participation from people who have questions and discussion matters. But the way we try to do this in the roundtable is through using the chat function. Put your comments at all down, and I will try to monitor these. And so when we're ready for Q&A, I'll try to summarize what many of the concerns are. If there's time, we can open the floor to verbal interaction, but it works well with a large group to have the chat function as the active way that we do that. So, Rich Applebaum, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dick. Can you folks see
Yes,
my screen?
yes.
Okay, well, first, Dick, thank you for that wonderful introduction. Sounded sort of like a promotion case for when I was still working at UCSB. I just want to mention, Dick mentioned CLUE. That stands, for those of you who don't know, Clergy and Laity United for Economic Justice. And the idea behind CLUE is to bring in people from all faiths to show up and testify, to kind of broaden the base of what we do. And we played a key role with other organizations in the $5 million to the local housing trust fund. So I'm supposed to address the issue, will rent control doom us? And Dick mentioned that I'd done quite a bit of work in a younger time of my life, but I've kind of returned to it since I retired, and I will give you some background information, then update you. So first, a little bit of background here. This chart is now a couple years old, but I think it's quite useful. It basically shows you that low-income households, the poorest households earning less than $50,000 a year, are overly rent burdened. And you can see The blue areas aren't coastal areas, the deeper blue areas. Um, Santa Barbara is often faulted, for having too many restrictions and so on, which is something that needs to be looked at. But it doesn't really matter where you are on the California coast. Low-income households are rent burdened, regardless of whether they are in communities like Santa Barbara or poorer communities. I also want to point out that fewer than 200 places in the U.S. currently have rent control. Most of them are in New Jersey. I'm going to talk about the New Jersey research that I did years ago and update it. And there are 18 in California, 63 in New York, and then a few others. So rent control is not national, but given the housing crisis everywhere, maybe it will be. So I thought this might be interesting just to point out. Basically, institutional investors increasingly control the rental housing market. And so this is from the Harvard Joint Center for Housing Studies. I'll just point out a few things. If you look at so-called mom and pop landlords, one in a unit or 2 to 4 units, fully a quarter of those are now institutional investors, which hide behind LLC and other corporate ratings. If you get up to the size, which is maybe most multifamily units in Santa Barbara, you're already up to nearly, well, 3 out of 5, just short of 2/3 are institutional investors. And larger places, these are national data, of course, which Santa Barbara doesn't have, it's almost 100%. And we've been struggling with this issue of institutional investors for some time. And they have clout. I think this is also worth thinking about as we mount a campaign and who the opposition will be. So when the first effort to update rent control was on the ballot in California, roughly $1/3 billion are spent in lobbying to defeat statewide propositions. Blackstone spent $6 million alone to defeat the local rent control initiative, Prop 21. And then when Prop 33 came on the ballot last year, California Apartment Owners Association and others, I love these names, Californians to Protect Affordable Housing, spent $125 million to defeat it. And I don't know if you can read the small print here, but this ad now on 33 claims was paid for by tenants and all sorts of great people. And it shows this young suffering woman because the rent control measure would have destroyed rental housing, according to them. And outspent 2 to 1, both of these went down in defeat. So, just something to think about in the back. A little background, I won't get into this because I'm pretty sure everyone on this call is familiar with this. But the Costa-Hawkins, the 2 legislators who passed this back in 95, basically exempted from rent control any construction built after February 1st, 1995. So that would be any new construction since then. And it permits vacancy decontrol, which means when a tenant moves out, the unit goes on the market rates. And this thing here was a haunted house movie about Costa-Hawkins. At the time I was involved in that, I worked somewhat for David Roberti's staff, trying to, present arguments against it, which obviously were not successful. California Tenant Protection Act of 2019, and then as amended by the Senate, actually did set rent control for California, 5% plus a CPI or 10%, whichever is lower. It, of course, permitted vacancy decontrol, which it has to under Costa-Hawkins, and permitted just cause evictions for such things as non-payment of rent, lease violations, but it also had loopholes. If the owner plans to withdraw the unit from the rental market, if a family member plans to move in, or if there's going to be substantial remodeling. Hard to track these things without having some type of a rental registry, as Ryan mentioned earlier. That's why a rental registry, I think, is crucial. Just a little background in Santa Barbara. Dick mentioned this. City Council had amended its just cause eviction ordinance back in January 24, which gave tenants the right to return after substantial renovations. But unfortunately, the City Council at the time balked at putting any type of rent cap on. So basically, it said you can move back, but under vacancy decontrol. This was fought, and that was fixed last April on a 4-2 vote, as I recall, which set the state cap on rent control applying to rent evictions, along with additional tenant protections. And as Dick said, what a difference an election makes. So let's build on this. The council changed then to a majority vote. I won't get into this. Now I'll get into the myths. I know we're short on time, but this chart I think is just useful in thinking about who falls into these areas. The area median in Santa Barbara income is $95,000, and extremely low is 30% of that, very low 30 to 50%, low 51 to 80, moderate 81 to 120, and above moderate, so-called missing middle, 121%, really and above that pretty much. And most of our workers fall in the low, extremely low to low income workers. Retail, firefighters, teachers, and so on, including many people who work for the city of Santa Barbara and have their own pay issues to deal with. But there are also many professionals who commute, and I'm not mistaken, the head of our housing authority commutes, I think, from Ventura to Santa Barbara. So myth number one, rent stabilization isn't needed. By the way, I always am kind of intrigued by how rent control became rent stabilization. Stabilization sounds so much better than control, so I understand that, but I guess rent stabilization maybe is a little more moderate than rent control. So let's look at this. You can see all the curves go up basically. So for studios, the current rent in Santa Barbara is $2,350. For a one bedroom, $2,883, almost $2,900. For two bedrooms, roughly, well, just shy of $4,000 for a two bedroom. And we had to average three and larger, but somewhere between $5,000 and $6,000 for larger apartments. So how onerous are these? Well, this is a confusing chart, but I'll just focus here on two-bedroom apartments. You have to be able to earn roughly $74 an hour in Santa Barbara to afford a two-bedroom apartment. That means an annual income of almost $154,000. The average household income is about $102,000. So you have to be earning 150% more to be able to afford a two-bedroom apartment than the average Santa Barbara renter actually is earning. And these numbers cascade throughout the whole chart, but you get the basic idea. Pretty much everybody is overpaying. So myth number two, what about the effect on new construction? That's why new construction was exempted from Costa-Hawkins. So I'll quote my former grad student, John Gilderblum. He and I, Dick mentioned this house book, Rethinking Rental Housing. Full confession, I've never been good with book titles. This did not win an award for titles, but it did have some influence on the tenants movement at the time. Our basic idea, this was Gilderblum's research, which was to compare rent control in New Jersey, taking matched cities, rent controlled and non-rent controlled, roughly the same size, roughly like Santa Barbara, self-contained housing markets, not part of large metro areas, and look at its effect. And we controlled for everything we could statistically. And I'll just look at new construction here, but basically contrary to what was predicted, we found there was considerably more construction in less construction decline in non-rent controlled cities than in rent-controlled cities. And then Gilderblum has updated this research periodically, most recently comparing rent-controlled cities, non-rent-controlled cities in New Jersey, and basically found the same thing. But interestingly enough, all of these studies, and I think this is important to think about, found that these moderate rent controls also did not have a great effect on rents. The effect was modest, but not, as they say, statistically significant. This was vacancy decontrol. Each community had its own rent control, and some were quite liberal. So this is something to think about. How strict can we be, and how strict can we be actually? I'll just mention the stuff that I did for a birdie, which I mentioned earlier, in which when I was really into number crunching, I did some economist time series analysis for Santa Monica, looking at other influence, and I found the only thing that really explained rental construction was true everywhere in California. In other words, the presence of rent control had no effect when you looked at multifamily housing construction throughout Southern California. So the market itself was strong, not rent control. Okay, myth number two. Oh, well, this is another aspect of myth number two here. I'll just point to one study here. The FHFA asked for information on tenant protections. 32 economists responded, and they crunched many numbers. They had many charts, which I didn't begin to understand. But their conclusion was that there was no substantial empirical evidence that rent regulation policies affected new construction or the overall housing supply. So there's data to look at if you can decode it from economist language. Myth number three, maintenance everything will turn into a slum. Well, basically, rent stabilization in California allows landlords to pass through maintenance. I think all rent control laws do that. That's required by California civil law, by the civil code. And it's an incentive, I would think, for landlords to make maintenance so they don't come up against a hard time where they have to spend scads of money in under-maintained buildings. And with the chart at the right, if you just look at over here, basically you can pass through maintenance costs, cost of living, utilities, property taxes, reasonable return. These are not draconian measures we're talking about. And the research on it is mixed. Depends really on how policies are designed, which is something down the line we'll be talking about. But the California cities with longstanding rent control don't have any more evidence of under maintenance than places that don't have rent control in California. It's always important to do comparisons. Final one is my favorite myth. Let the market do its magic. Build, 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 baby, build. Filtering, you build at the top, it comes down. So I'll just make a couple of points here in a much longer argument. Yet in Santa Barbara, housing demand is inelastic, as it is in many coastal communities. Anyone can live here who has the money. Anyone can move in, can buy a second unit, a third, a fourth unit. Harry and Meghan being my favorite. But a little research I learned that Greta Garbo, whose picture I put up there in the corner, was also one of the early residents here. And you don't have to be super wealthy either. And another factor is work status, remote commuting. Many, many people, I personally know, middle-class people live in Santa Barbara and work elsewhere. And they tend to be in the tech business, in higher-end professional work. The National Bureau of Economic Research did a fairly interesting study recently, in this current year, of 300 metropolitan areas, charting work trends from 1980 to 2020, which is a 40-year period. And their conclusion is rising incomes from remote work are more strongly linked to increasing housing costs than local supply constraints such as zoning, limited land, and so forth. And that looks like my deck there. But that's not me. So demand side factors, especially income growth and remote work, play a large role in driving up housing costs. So filtering the market won't do it. So a couple other points to make here, and then I'll end. Every California locality has its regional housing needs allocation, its RHNA requirements. The city is now on track to meet its 2031 six-cycle goals for above moderate income households, those earning above 120% of the median. It'll be more than halfway if La Cumbre Plaza pans out, We don't know what's going to happen with Paseo Nuevo, but that'll be more. The problem is housing production for low to moderate income households. This is a chronic lagging problem, especially tenants who are earning less than 80% of area median income. And I'll make this point when I conclude, which is rent control is a stopgap measure. It slows problems down at already unconscionably high rent levels, but we need other approaches, which I mentioned. So I'm just going to point out a couple of things. This is our last RENA cycle from 2015 to 2022. Of 962 required for very low income, 120 were built over the previous 5 years. It's 12% of our very low income requirement. 16% of our low income requirement, zilch on our moderate income requirement, but 84% for above moderate. So we did pretty well where the market works. But where the market doesn't work, we really sucked. And our current RENA requirements, basically almost 2/3 of the required housing that we need below above moderate income, that is low, very low, and moderate, requires subsidies to be affordable, requires some type of public assistance. This is where rent control is really crucial. So a final thought, just to emphasize it, what we like to call social housing, despite its connotations, which is public subsidized housing, permanently affordable, outside the for-profit market, has to happen. Our housing authority has done a great job with limited resources of providing some of this, but it's been a struggle all the way along to make this happen. And finally, just to end on a highly personal note, so way back in the day, a bill was introduced by Ron Delms, the Social Housing Production and Financing Act. It directed the HUD secretary to establish national social housing production goals and to fund them. And it basically said that it had to be paid for, and beginning with 1990, all future HUD funding would be for social housing. Well, of course, that didn't happen. I don't know if Delms ever got any co-authors, but I played a lead role in organizing that effort. We pulled together a coalition of progressive housing people around the country. We spent a year on a funded effort to produce this proposal, and now more than ever. So I'll just leave you with this thought. Never forget, we have our work cut out for us. So thank you, and I'll turn it over to Ryan.
Go ahead, Ryan.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that was great, Richard. Thank you so much. It's a privilege to be here with you. And as I mentioned in the chat, we've cited to your work in the past, and other literature reviews always look at that New Jersey study, and it's been really, really valuable. My name is Ryan Bell. I'm really honored to be here. I'm probably the only one that's not from Santa Barbara or the close environment, so I'm honored to be with you. I live in Pasadena, as Dick mentioned. I was a leader of the campaign to pass. Sorry, am I frozen? Can you hear me all right? Okay. Okay, good. My internet is sometimes a little wonky. I was a leader of the campaign to pass rent control and just cause in 2022 in Pasadena on the ballot. It was easily the hardest thing I've ever done, other than raising two daughters, which I think I was more successful at passing the the rent control ordinance, because it's a very defined, concrete objective. Kids are complicated. But my kids are amazing. But yeah, really challenging, but we did it. And I think nobody thought we would be able to do it. The political class, even the donors and people on our side, and including me at times, didn't think we would be able to do it. But we collected 20,000 signatures, 15,000 of which were valid. And then we convinced 54% of the voters in the city to vote for it. In fact, my avatar, if I put my video on pause, you can see this is actually me speaking at a press conference announcing that we had collected, the adequate number of signatures. And I keep it there, and I haven't changed it because I still haven't done anything that I'm more excited about than that. So that's a reminder to me that we can do this. I was asked to talk about how this works in practice. And the first thing to say about that is that when advocates and opponents of rent control talk about rent control, we often talk about it as if it's one thing. But when it comes down to the policy, there are lots of ways of implementing rent control, or we sometimes say rent stabilization. We actually did polling in Pasadena before we ran our campaign and found that rent control actually polls quite well, but the political class is a little creeped out by anything that says control. So, use whatever expression suits you and works for you. So once we passed this, because it wasn't a city council initiative, the city council was kind of caught by surprise. They didn't think it was going to pass. And they all quickly huddled and said, well, what do we do now? And immediately the apartment association, the California Apartment Association, sued us. They filed an injunction claiming that they would experience irreparable immediate harm. The judge threw that out. Then we went to trial on a variety of issues, and they lost. And then they filed an appeal, the oral arguments of which were just yesterday, in fact. Their appeal has been pending for a year and 8 months, and we just had oral arguments, and they're probably going to lose again. So one of the things I like to say is lawsuits are scary and the city doesn't like them, but think of it as a way to defeat the apartment association yet again. So we've beat them 3 times now, and we look forward to beating them many more times in the future. Like all laws, I think one of our comrades is on here who I'm stealing this quote from. Gosh, under pressure, I'm forgetting his name, but you'll know his name when I say the quote. Laws are not real. And they are just figments of our imagination. They're agreements that we come up with. We've never had more evidence of that than right now in the United States, that laws are only, yes, Alex, thank you. I stole that quote from Alex. Laws are not real. And so they're only as good as the enforcement of them. And tenants need to enforce their own rights in most cases. But you can, as a city, build a policy that what we call an active enforcement model of rent stabilization, where the city, through a variety of means, can enforce these laws to a certain extent. So I'm going to go through a few things that we've learned about active enforcement. And there are things that Anna's going to talk about in a minute, so I'm not going to go into detail on them. But one is a rental registry. Most cities don't know how many rental units they have. That sounds absurd when you say it and hear it. Most city council members will say things like, hey, could staff come back with a report about how many rental units we have in the city? And staff sort of sheepishly says, well, we'd love to do that, but we actually don't know. What do you mean you don't know? We'll find out. Well, with respect, there's no data on this. And people are just dumbfounded by it. You have the assessor records in the county, and you have maybe some public utility, if you have a public utility records, but it's very difficult to know renter occupied single family homes and condos. It's very difficult to know if the owner lives there or not. So the rental registry is the way that you find out. It takes time, a year or more, to finally get a clear number, but this will enable you to know who the landlords are and who the tenants are and how much the rent is, and are people following the law, because they have to update their filing every year and say what the rents are that are being charged. And ideally, it has a public-facing side where tenants can go there and say, is this actually what I'm paying? Like, did the landlord tell the truth about that? So that's one thing, rental registry. The rent board, which I know you're also fighting for, is really important as well. But again, rent boards are not created equally. There are rent boards and there are rent boards, right? So I don't know if your city has commissions. Do you have citizen commissions on various topics in Santa Barbara? Okay. Some of you may have served on those. My experience, I've never lived in Santa Barbara, but my experience here in Pasadena is that they're fairly toothless and innocuous and almost have no power. They make suggestions to the city council that they almost always ignore. And by ignore, I mean, we've asked them to put things on their agenda that they just never put on their agenda. And it just goes in the round file and you never hear from it again. So we've created a rent board in Pasadena and many cities like Santa Monica and Berkeley and San Jose and other places and Richmond have rent boards with some authority that don't need to have every regulation approved by city council. So this is really an important feature of a enforcement program because we can create regulations that will spell out what the ordinance, how the ordinance is implemented and how certain aspects of your tenant protections get carried out. So for example, if you have rent control and you say this year, according to the formula, the max rent increase is 3%. That's all well and good until the tenant gets a rent increase of 6%, right? And they say, wait a second, I heard we have rent control. And they call the office and somewhere in the city and they tell you, yep, sure enough, 3%, your landlord's overcharging you. Great, what do I do now? Well, you call your landlord and tell them that they're wrong and that they need to resubmit the filing. And they ignore you, let's say. And then you say, well, I'm only going to pay the 3%. I'm not going to pay the extra 3% because that's illegal. And then the landlord sues you for an unlawful detainer and takes you to court because you haven't paid your rent. And then you use that as a defense against an eviction in court, claiming that you're actually paying the correct rent. And hopefully you get a commissioner or a judge in the courtroom that knows anything about Santa Barbara's unique laws and that they honor that law. And you're taking a big risk, right? And tenant organizers, we know that we're always taking lots of risks together, so it's often worth it. What's better, though, is if there is a local process whereby the rent board can create a hearings division, for example, where the tenant could then file a petition with the city saying, I believe my landlord's overcharging me for rent. And then the hearing officer reaches out to the landlord and says, hey, we've received this petition. They're saying that you're overcharging them for rent. Let's talk about it. And most cases, the landlord realizes that they really don't have a way out of this and they don't really want the expense of going to court only to lose. And they're convinced that they actually are caught in, like that they need to revise, and they revise the rent increase. We recently, well, our law also had a rent rollback. Anna will talk about that, I believe, as well. The reason for a rent rollback is that the minute landlords find out that you're talking about rent control and that you're campaigning for rent control, they will preemptively jack the rent up as high as they can to get ahead of any future regulations. So what the rent rollback does is it says, if and when this passes, or let's say when this passes, the new base rent for everyone is, let's say, this is September 2025. Let's say it's June 2024. That's the base rent. And everybody's rent goes back to that at the time that this ordinance is passed and goes into effect. And again, this depends on landlords complying with the law. I informed my landlord of the rent rollback and she just did it. Other people were taken to court, over it. Recently, however, our hearing officers and our housing counselors in the rent department, one building, I'll just give you one example because I just learned about it. There's a building of 31 units that never got their rent rollback, plus they were getting illegal rent increases on top of that. They recently recovered $75,000 in overpaid rent for those 31 tenants. That's a lot of money. And so it does work. People can get savings. I always said with the rent rollback, it's the one and only time your rent will ever go down. Like Rich said, there's rent can be stabilized. It almost never goes down. No matter what the market urbanists tell you, it'll only go up maybe a little bit less, but it always goes up. And this is an opportunity for it to go down. So I mentioned rental registry. I talked about the rent board and its authority to create programs of enforcement. One of those programs is housing counselors. So we employ in the rent department about 5 housing counselors. These are people who not only answer phones, but primarily respond to tickets that they get through an online form from tenants and landlords who have questions about the ordinance and want to know how it's being implemented and what they're supposed to do. Everything from I'm confused about the rental registry, how do I do this, to tenants calling in to say, I think I got a rent increase that's too much. Can you help me figure that out? Is my unit covered by rent control? Because that's a complicated question. As Richard said, some units are covered and some units are not. Some units are exempted by Costa-Hawkins, and the housing counselor can help the tenant come to a conclusion about, is their unit registered? And then the hearing officers, we talked a little bit about them. They are quasi-judicial officers, so they can make rulings. And the way our system is set up is that when the hearing officer makes a ruling, there's a pre-hearing conference where oftentimes things get worked out. We also employ mediation through the Loyola Center for Conflict Resolution. And often these problems between landlords and tenants can be resolved through mediation or through the pre-hearing conference, which you've probably heard of a pre-trial conference. So it's like that, only for a hearing. Most of these cases never actually get to the hearing because most of the time the truth is discovered and people realize, the hearing's not going to do any good. I'm just going to have to comply with this. But if it does go to a hearing, the hearing officer's ruling is like a judge's ruling. Now, if the landlord or the tenant want to appeal that ruling, they can appeal it, and the rent board is the appellate body for that appeal. And the rent board then hears the evidence, testimony, witnesses, whatever you like, whatever the parties like, according to the regulations that we've created. And then the rent board will make a ruling. If the landlord doesn't like, or the tenant doesn't like that decision, they have the right to judicial review. So they can take it to the superior court and say, I think my rights were violated by not only the hearing officer, but also the rent board. And then the court will decide. And if they don't like that, they can go to the appeals court, and so on and so on. So sometimes in these opposition arguments, they love to say in one breath, as if it's, instead of saying the rent board, they'll say the unelected, unaccountable rent board. It's like one word. The unaccountable, unelected rent board. And they say that every single time in their newsletters, in their public comments, constantly over and over and over. But I always like to remind folks that we are accountable to the same judicial system as everyone else. If we were to say, guess what, the rent increase this year is 0, they would sue us, right? And we would go to court and we would lose. So to say that we have this absolute power to do all these things is just hyperbole on their part. So what we've really found is that so far, and we're just building this out, we actually haven't had any cases go to a hearing yet. Because, like as I said, a lot of the cases are resolved in pre-hearing conversations. But a lot of these cases can avoid going to court. Tenants don't generally have resources to hire an attorney to go to court to say, for example, my front door doesn't lock. This is a violation of my state habitability rights. Is a tenant going to hire an attorney and fight that? They're probably going to go to Home Depot and try to buy a lock and do it themselves. If they don't know how to do that or don't have the ability to do that, they shouldn't have to do that. They can file a petition with the hearing officer and say, I have these habitability issues. And with a partnership with the code enforcement, there can be direction given to the landlord to fix these things. There can be fines administered if they aren't fixed, and the tenant can have their rent reduced to compensate them for lack of habitability. Last night, in fact, we had a rent board meeting last night, and we just discussed a schedule of rent reductions for habitability concerns, as well as for reductions in services. So let's say the landlord is in a bad mood and they say, guess what? You guys don't have a laundry room anymore. Happens all the time. The tenants can go to the rent department, file a petition and say, the landlord took away our laundry. They may or may not be able to get the laundry back, but they will be assigned, each of them, a $200 and something rent reduction per unit for the reduction in that service. So there are ways of penalizing the landlord for failing to comply with these regulations. Let me check how much time I have, because I have just a couple more things.
Well, you're coming to an end, but before you close, could you tell us the budget? How much does all this cost, the staffing,
Yeah.
and what is the population of Pasadena, so we can make a little comparison on that? Okay.
Right. These are great questions. So we have about 140,000 people, about 90,000 voters for that was important for our charter amendment.
Rose.
Units. Was someone asking a question?
No, go ahead.
Okay, so we think we have around 25,000 rental units. We thought we had more like 33,000. We have a pretty maximal system, so don't be alarmed when I tell you the budget, because you don't have to. This is the thing. You can create any kind of program you want. You can have contract hearing officers that you only pay when you need them. You don't have to employ them in your city staff, for example. So our budget is around $6 million a year. And that includes everything. That's the staff, that's the rental registry, the maintenance of the rental registry, all of our hearing officers, our housing counselors. The rent board gets a modest hourly pay, and we have dinner. They provide dinner for us because the meetings are at 6 o'clock. So all of those petty expenses, we record our meetings, there's all kinds of these little expenses. All of it comes out to around 6 million. You divide that number by the number of rental units, and it comes out to around $238 per unit per year. This is not welcome news to the landlords, but a little bit of math, and you can show that this is about $20 a month per unit, which is cheaper than a Netflix subscription, we sometimes like to say. And it's about 1% of the median rent for that unit, for an average unit. So, they're collecting $30,000 a year on rent for that unit. They're paying around $300, let's say, just for round numbers, $300 in a rental registry fee. You can make it easily 200 or less than 200. Some cities it's around 150, 100. You can customize a program that meets your needs, and it can scale, right? You don't have to. You can build $100 a month, $100 per unit per year type of program. And then in 3 years decide, look, we need more robust enforcement. Let's expand the program. You can build a $200 type of program and then decide, we have too many hearing officers. We don't need all these people. Although that's a little bit harder with city employment, laying people off is not easy to do and probably not pleasant. So I guess my point is you can customize this to your city. Plus you have fewer units and you have fewer people, so it won't be a budget of quite of that size. The last thing I want to say is, like, as advocates, as organizers, just keep an eye on the staff, and especially like the city attorney. City attorneys, in my experience, love to tell you all the things you can't do. It's a great idea to have a second opinion, because a lot of times when the city attorney says we're not allowed to do that, what it really means is we would prefer not to do that. But you can discover that other cities have done such things, whatever it is you're talking about. And the risk tolerance of a city attorney is usually around 0, and your risk tolerance may be higher than that. So start with what you want, have some negotiating room, and insist that your city attorney and others are frank with you about what other cities are doing. If they say such and such is illegal, ask for the evidence of that. Say, I'm not questioning your expertise. I would just like to see like the case, like what are you talking about? Why is that illegal? Because I understand other cities do that. There may be a reason in your city why that doesn't work, but it's good to ask them for the evidence. Like rent withholding. I'll just finish with one example. Our regulations that the rent board has passed say, for example, that if the hearing officer says, you know what, the tenant's right, you've been overcharging them rent, you owe them $1,000 refund, and the landlord just chooses not to follow that hearing officer order. What our regulations say is that the tenant is then authorized, that the hearing officer will authorize the tenant to withhold rent for future rent on a certain schedule until they recover that $1,000. Now, rent withholding is risky because a landlord, understand, has a litigation privilege. They can sue you for anything at any time, for like a UD. So there is a risk attendant with it, but a hearing officer order will be a defense against an eviction. Our city attorney would like us to get rid of that whole rent withholding remedy. But the rent board said, no, we want to keep that rent withholding remedy because we think tenants should be individually responsible for assessing their own risk tolerance. We don't think we should be assessing the risk tolerance of tenants for them. So if they want to withhold rent and take that risk of going to court, that's up to them to do that, as long as they understand the risk that they're taking. There's a lot more to say, but I'll stop there. I know I'm taking up too much time, but thanks for having me, and I'll be here for questions.
Great. Well, thank you, Ryan. And we'll go right to Anna, and she can tell us how this all applies to us here in Santa Barbara and what the process is going forward.
Thank you. Let me just share my screen. So while I set this up, just a little bit of my background as well. I'm the newer kid on this side of the block, but I have been working with housing as I was a caseworker in the past. I have a background with United Way with AmeriCorps. So I supported folks who were experiencing homelessness and housing insecurities in our city. Are you all able to see my slides?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, perfect. And so let me present it. And prior to that as well, I supported youth in Santa Barbara, who I started off with youth who were system impacted. And I realized that a lot of these youth, the reason why there was issues or in school and academics and being able to be successful in our communities wasn't merely because they didn't want to pay attention to the teacher. It was because there was housing instability, there was like work, there was other factors that were playing in. And when us as a community were able to provide that support for the students and for the youth, they became successful, they felt included, they felt like they could achieve things, and they were important in our community. So that's a little bit of my background. And so now we can go into our slides. So we're focusing on rent stabilization now. So as it was mentioned, it is a newer term. And especially for our city, we know that our city loves to have like nice words, beautiful things that are more impactful. And so, introduction, a little bit about Cause. So, Cause is a base building nonprofit organization that is committed to social change, economic and environmental justice for working class and immigrant communities. And we have different offices. So we have an office in Santa Barbara, Oxnard, Ventura, Santa Paula, Santa Maria, and we have a brand new office coming up in Lompoc. So we're very excited about that. And our main focus areas are workers' rights, affordable housing, environmental justice, and civic engagement with voters. And so what is rent stabilization? So a big breakdown of this is like it's a part of a larger housing system. So it can't work on its own. It needs to be aligned with policies that reinforce one another. So you need the rent stabilization aligned with everything that's going on with RENA and like with development in our city, things that are aligned with homeless services, with housing retention in our city, those policies, everything needs to be interconnected with one another so it can strengthen our city as a whole. It ensures that everybody knows their rights and responsibilities, and all these pieces, like I said, must work together in order to be effective. And so what is the difference between rent control and rent stabilization? I won't go super into detail. I also share the slides with Nancy, who you all are more than happy to have a copy of these slides if you want to share them out as resources as well. So the basic way to understand is that rent control is like freezing your rent in time. So paying $500 a month for an apartment since the 70s. And rent stabilization is putting a speed limit to rent. So there's still, like Ryan and Rich mentioned, there's still going to be increases. It's just monitor the rules and regulations, and it also prevents being overpriced over time. And so this is a visual representation of rent stabilization. So as Ryan mentioned, there is a rental registry, a rent cap, and a rent board. So that is the umbrella. And there's, as Ryan mentioned, it can be customized according to what fits our city. And I know there's folks here who are from North County as well. So if you're thinking about rent stabilization in your counties or in your cities, customizing it to what the need is for your city. And underneath that umbrella are different other policies that can be included, like anti-harassment protections, the Ellis Act, the tenant relocation assistance, just cause for all, and other things. So these are just very limited. Local wins that we have had locally, in addition to rent stabilization, as was mentioned, was the Just Cause Ordinance, which was recently amended. The right to counsel, which the pilot program we currently still have for another year, and rental housing mediation. And in Oxnard, there's currently a 4% rent cap currently in effect. So some of, if we look in the corner, some of the narratives that may cause the community pause or may cause folks to not, feel like, why do we need this rent stabilization? What is this? We can just build, like Rich said. That is the abundance agenda. So if you hear that, that's what that part is. There's folks who just are very dismissive about it, like, well, why don't you just move? Like, I hear Oxnard is great. I hear Santa Paula is great. I hear Thousand Oaks is up and coming, or, we're paying for the location. Like, where else can you see Taylor Swift, like, strolling around, or Kim Kardashian? Like, where else can you see the Prince, So it's like you pay for that environment, but that's not a good reason to hike up our rents. And then costs are increasing for developers. Home ownership is the only way. Like, if everybody owned their house, then there would be no need for renters because everybody owns their house. But we know that's not feasible as well. So that's why we need all these aspects. We need home ownership. We need tenant protections. We need everything to coincide with one another. And so to ensure like affordability and safe and habitability into our housing. And so strategies. So now that we know what rent stabilization is, how do we go about this? So there's different strategies that we can go about this. So one is very, very powerful, which is storytelling. So our stories together win hearts and minds. How has this been impactful? So for me personally, I have experienced homelessness in Santa Barbara as a young mom. And so I went to the transition house here locally and I loved the shelter there. At first, obviously, I was very young. So I was like, going to a shelter? What do you mean? But once I was in there, I learned very powerful tools that I needed. And I learned how to budget. I felt safe. I felt included in our community. Uh, I was able to utilize those resources that I have continued to utilize now in my current role as well. So that's very powerful. Like if there's stories behind, your neighbors who have been priced out, your teachers who've had to leave the area, all that's very powerful. There was one public comment that I always remember of a pediatrician at Cottage Hospital who said that they were scared because their home was being renovated and they didn't know if they were going to be able to afford living in Santa Barbara any longer. And I'm like, wow, this is somebody who's educated, a pediatrician, somebody we need, and they're even worried, where does that put me? And so proven data, so quantitative data, so everything that I mentioned on here, SBCAG, rental housing service, housing report, these are information that is already available. And all the information that Rich also provided earlier, that's all information that has been done. The research has been done. The conversations have been made. This is not something new. Qualitative data, so op-eds, public comments, social media, news stories, organizing, very, very important. We have an amazing organizer with Cause who organizes all our leaders and all our base and like spreads out like that information. And that's very, very important. Phone banking, canvassing. Other examples are like our adult committees, power assemblies through SBTU. And here, you all being here are already strategizing. So kudos to you all for being here on your lunch break on a Friday. You all are already part of that strategy plan, and you're already included in the conversation. And so okay, so now I know how to strategize. I know what it is, but I don't know what's going to happen, or I don't even know what an ordinance is. So I'm not going to go super into detail on this. I'll share with Nancy all the slides, but the first step is research and study. So that's when the staff gets directed to do whatever research needs to do, what is the money's coming from, what's going to happen, how is this going to affect staff and other priorities. Community, this needs heavy emphasizing on this is not a new problem. This is an issue that has been impacted in all levels of our community. And what has been done in the past, very important to speak to our coalition partners, speak to like Ryan from Tenants Together, what has been done in other areas, and can be a realistic solution for our city. And then after that, it's the ordinance language. This is a part that a lot of folks, get lost because it's all that nitty gritty, all that legal, everything that we need to add. But it's very important because this is where we provide what we want on the actual ordinance. So it can include a list of these team players to draft that, but it's not limited to this. And also for community action points, it's very important to learn how it's going to be funded, how it's going to be implemented, what may cause delays. So if there's turnaround in our city, if there's changing staff freezes, like they're not hiring folks, or right now, recently, as we saw the report, how, our budget is looking at, may they see that as like an opportunity to stall. And so what solutions do we have for that? And then it goes into hearings and committees and reviews. These are very important because some of the finance committees and ordinance committees meetings are a lot smaller, and our city council members serve in different specific committees. And so it's a good time to also catch them and also like be able to engage with them and try to influence the direction that they'll recommend for council. And which is really great. And like I said, this is just a recommendation. So then it goes to council, and council then decides as a whole where it moves. So, and after that, it's the council voting. So after the revision, staff, everybody gone through the city attorney, everything's great. A simple majority is required for this step. This is that final lobbying push, that final push, like, yes, we're great, we love this. Or if staff took a whole U-turn and went the whole other direction and they didn't have anything that we were pushing for, then it's also very, very important to go and say, hey, this is not what we recommended. Does not look like anything that we were asking for. And that's also important to voice as well. And also sharing again your story, like how will this impact you and your community once this passes? And then after that is implementation. So best case scenario, everything went great, all our long days and everything, all the work that Rich and everybody did, like, back in the 70s, like it all was for this moment and it passed. And yes, after that takes 30 days to take into effect. And then let's say it doesn't pass. Worst case scenario, the first one thing that can happen is the ordinance is done, it dies, and community decides not to continue with this. That's one thing that can happen to council motions to revise the language. This doesn't really happen at this stage in our city from what I've seen, because from this, like, it's under the assumption that it has already been revised a couple of times. It has gone to stakeholders. This was supposed to be that final for that vote. But it can happen. And then last, we learned from the reasons why it wasn't passed, and we come back and come back and come back, which is what we've been doing. We've been coming back and maybe call different things at different stages, but at the end of the day, we need these tenant protections. We need protections with these rent hikes, and we know that our rents are way too high, and we need to continue until we get the protections that we need. And as we've seen from what we've learned from Ryan and other cities, is that this is ever evolving. So don't let, like, okay, we have this ordinance and that's it. No, it's ever evolving because we're ever learning, and we amend as we go. And so then it is also very, very, very important to hold our electives accountable, create and reinforce specific talking points throughout our action calls, and correct misinformation. Very important. We have that heavy burden that we have to correct any misinformation that's out there, sharing our stories again and again and again. And follow-up is very important, because it's not just about going to council one meeting, having our dinner there, and like, showing up and everything. And great, we were on the newspaper, and then there's no follow-up, because like we've seen in other things, when we do recommendations and there's no follow-up, then it goes into the void. And for example, our ad hoc committee about a year ago, there was priorities that were uplifted during those meetings, and council had their recommendations during those meetings, but there has been no follow-up in regards to those priorities and recommendations. So that's where we have to hold our electives accountable, as to like, hey, this was a year ago and there's like nothing happening. So where's that follow-up? And also, I know we're focusing very, very heavily on like city, but it's also very important to speak to our state representatives, and also express to them how the state's legislature also affects locally, how that impacts us locally when they're also making their decisions. So I know we're not touching on that today, but that's also very important to highlight. And we have really great representatives in our district that we can reach out to if we need to, and learn more about what's going on statewide and how that may or impact us locally. So, and so I got this quote from shout out Stanley. There's no one hero, but it will take all of us. So we can all like come together and be a voice in this. And there's like different levels that we can all join in together. Even if it is people think like, oh, I have to organize like a big round table and like it's going to be overwhelming or I have to know all these points. No, just hey, sit outside with your neighbor and say, hey, damn, like the rent went up again. Like, what's going on? And our toilet's still broken. Like, there's Alice in Wonderland in the toilet. Like, I don't understand. So having those conversations, or if you know you're a dog person, I myself am a cat person. Sorry, but if you know you go to a dog park and like, hey, how's your landlord with your dog, or you know what's going on, having those conversations is also very important. So we can all commit to one thing today, you know, commit to that to your with yourself, and one thing that you're going to do to uplift and share why we need rent stabilization, or even just starting the conversation as to like, hey, how do you feel about the rent? How do you feel about what's going on in Santa Barbara? And so this is my contact information. Feel free to reach out. We have a lot of plants in our office, so you're all more than welcome to come hang out, have coffee with us. Feel free to, you know, learn and more. You're always welcome, every single one of you. So, and yeah, so that's it. So I'll pass it back on to
Thank you so much
yeah.
from all of you. Thank you very much. So you said the slides were going to be available in general. Nancy, can you just say how people can get those? Because the slides are magnificent, detailed, laying out of so much about the issues. So
Yeah,
Nancy,
in our next action alert, I'll make sure to post that video in the email blast, and then I'll include a link to the slideshow as well.
okay, I think maybe as time, if we have everybody's email, which we do, we can get in touch with people going forward with further instructions about from the organizers, from Anna and Cause about things that they need to do. So my understanding, by the way, is that we have a very active members of council who are preparing to put this on the agenda, who are trying to work right now with city attorney to come up with what the law might be framed as. They'd like to get as much, I believe, drafted on paper when this comes to the council. And I think some people on the council have said they'd like to get this done by the end of the year. So uh, this is that's really why we wanted to have this roundtable now, because the campaign may grow quick pretty intensely from here on in. And certainly there's going to be debate and argument and about rent control. That's what there always is. By the way, in case anyone had any question about this, which I think somebody did on chat, this was not to set up a debate about rent control. The assumption is this was aimed at people who are sympathetic to the issue and want to learn more about how they can actually understand how it would work and what we would favor in the way of specific provisions and how they can contribute to the campaign. So if you missed a voice against rent control, Rich did summarize their arguments, and I think the data, and he didn't even cite some of the more recent data from cities, show that at least what rent stabilization can accomplish is what the name of it says, stabilizing the ability of people who are living in affordable housing in a city to be able to stay in the city, to be able to stay in their homes, much more able to do that with rent control ordinance. It, as everyone has said, and as we've been very clear in our coalition efforts, rent control is a stopgap. It's one part of a broader, much broader agenda for social housing, for housing that can enable working people to live where they work, to enable a community to keep its community vital and alive for everybody. Um, and I know there was at least one question back for you, Ryan, in terms of did did the costs you had going in have they been greater since then that you expected? What did you learn over the last 2 years about the costs? Linda has,
Yeah.
yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll try to be quick on these because I know we're running out of time. The we what was interesting about our situation is that we were impaneled as a board, and I'll talk a little bit more about the composition of the board as well. I think Richard had a question about that. And we didn't have any city staff, and we didn't have a city attorney assigned to us. We didn't have any like real support. So we hired a consultant who had experience running a rent stabilization department in 2 different cities in California. And one of the things they did for us was a cost analysis of a fully fleshed out program as sort of envisioned by our charter. And we've come pretty close to that cost. But as you can imagine, like, it just isn't logical. Like, you can't hire 20 people at once. Like, you hire one person, then you hire one more, and then you hire one more. So it has scaled up over 2.5 years now. And it's been about what we think is important. I also want to emphasize too that budget numbers for government are quite like sticker shocky for people that aren't used to dealing with municipal budgets. If it's your personal budget, of course, it sounds like an enormous amount of money. But the city of Pasadena has a $1 billion budget. And so $6 million is, I don't know, like a 6% or less than well, I'm bad at math, but whatever that is. It's not that big, and it is cost neutral to the city budget, as it is like a cost of service fee that the landlord pays per unit. So it also is a progressive fee in the sense that it applies per unit. So if you're a mom and pop landlord with one unit, then you pay one fee, right? If you have 10,000 units, then you pay the fee times 10,000 units. So that's the cost of the program is borne more heavily by people that have more units. I wanted to go back to one of Richard's questions, if I can. In our case, the rent board is appointed by the city council. There's basically 2 models, an elected rent board and an appointed rent board. The elected model is used in Berkeley and in Santa Monica, to cite 2 examples. The advantage there is that you can exercise more autonomy. The disadvantage is that the community and has to run candidates every 2 years, because usually it's every 2 years, half of the group. Well, yeah, it's like a 4-year term, and every 2 years, half of them have to be reelected. So that's one way to go. The other way to go is to have it appointed. With an appointed rent board, you are at the will of the city council who they appoint. We specified how many tenants and how many non-tenants could be on the board. Our provision is an 11-member board with 7 tenants and 4 at large. The 7 tenants are 1 from each council district, and the 4 can be from anywhere in the city. And we did that because most of our elected bodies are very heavy on property owners and landlords, and almost no tenants. Our city council hasn't had a tenant in 10 years. And before that, it was decades, if ever, before that. Like, we've had 1 tenant, I think, on our city council in our whole city's history. So to have the voices of tenants representing themselves, it's sort of like a police oversight commission, having members of the community, overseeing the police department, it's probably best not to have a bunch of cops, on the police oversight commission if you really want robust oversight. So that's kind of the rationale there. We do pay our rent board members 2.5 times the minimum wage for time spent in meetings, which comes out right now in Pasadena to about $45 an hour. I think folks get paid roughly $200 to $300 a month for 2 board meetings a month. We currently meet twice a month. They go 3 to sometimes 4 hours, depending on the agenda. We do envision going back to 1 meeting a month soon once our base regulations are established. We did that 2.5 times the minimum wage so that folks in the community who are on limited incomes can serve, and pay their baby. One of our folks pays almost their entire wage that they get from the rent board to their babysitter, so that they can have the free time to come to the board meeting. So that's the intention behind that.
Well, listen, one thing, Ryan, occurs to me to ask is the rental registries in effect, right? And have you already seen ability to learn not only what are the rental units, but who owns them? Is there more insight now about who owns rental property in Pasadena as a result of the registry? You want to mention that?
Yeah, there is. I am actually not yet privy to that information. So we're just entering our second cycle of rental registration. Um, you can imagine the first cycle is the most painful because we're asking landlords to do something they've never had to do before. And in addition to that, we're asking them to pay a fee, which nobody loves to do that. Every time you have to go to the DMV and pay a fee, like everybody kind of grumble, grumble, grumble. But the second time it's way easier because it's like, I guess I would liken it to paying your taxes on TurboTax. Like if your marital status and your exemptions are the same, the tax software just repopulates that information every year. You don't have to re-enter everything. If you still own the same units, you just keep the information there and change the stuff that's changed. So we got about a 90% compliance in the first year. We didn't have any late fees applied, so people had the whole year to tinker around with it and finally get themselves registered. We've sort of come to the conclusion that the final 9 to 10% are deliberately recalcitrant and are refusing to comply. So we have added some late fees now, and there is a concern now about collections, going to collections for some of those, and also prosecution. So our charter allows for the city prosecutor to engage in prosecution of people that are willfully and flagrantly violating the city charter. So that's also an option that we hope to avoid, but that's possible. And we are getting a sense of the units, and I think it very much matches what Richard's chart showed, that most of the landlords are small landlords, but most of the units are owned by large landlords. So if you have 1,000 landlords, let's say maybe 600 of them are small, we would say 4 units and less. And maybe 40% of them have more than that. But 80% of the units are owned by that larger group, the people that have 40, 50 units or up per building. Now, Santa Barbara's a different city. You don't have rental towers, and stuff as much. You probably have some, but maybe not. Like, I don't know. We have a few. City of LA, of course, has tons of 30, 40 story rental towers and that type of thing. So every market is a little bit different, but we are getting a better picture of the rental market. And we hope to share some of that information. We have an annual report coming out later this year. Our charter requires us to give either annual or quarterly reports to the city council. So our first fancy annual reports coming out, I think, in November. So we'll be sure to share that widely with
Does the
folks.
rental registry enable enforcement of short-term rental restrictions?
That's a great question. It can. A lot of cities have that type of rental registry separate from what we're talking about, but it can be incorporated, I believe. And I think 3DI is the company we use to build our rental registry, and they do other short-term registry short-term rental registries. So that can be incorporated. Maybe the two systems can talk to each other. Maybe they can be incorporated into the same system. But that's especially for a city like Santa Barbara, I know it's got to be a big, big concern for y'all.
So I think the cost issue, despite the fact that the landlords are paying fees to enable the cost to be covered, is going to be one of the talking points they're going to have to deal with. So,
Yeah.
because the city staff is very obsessed with the fact that their budget shortfalls and that kind of thing.
I
That's
think you can lean into the idea that it's not going to hit the budget. The downside politically for them is that it will touch the owners of the properties. But, you know, it can be a nominal fee. Like it can be something quite easy to explain. It's also a tax write-off, you know, to business expense that they can include in their expenses against their profits. And I think it's, you know, important to just emphasize to the city that this is a cost neutral program that's paid for by the business owner, the same way that business owners pay for restaurant inspections and, you know, have a fee that they pay for a license to operate a restaurant. And someone comes out once in a while and makes sure that the mayonnaise is kept at the right temperature so that somebody doesn't get sick.
so I'm being a little interruptive because we want to get everything in. So Lisa, Carlos, you have a question relating to costs. You want to articulate it out loud? What your question?
Yeah, hold on. Sorry. So I was talking to someone who was in Santa Monica when Santa Monica's passed in the 1970s. He was general counsel for the county for a number of years. And I asked him, I said, you know, is there any strategy you have for minimizing the cost? Because I agree with Dick and others here that this will be an issue. And one suggestion he had, and so I'm throwing it out to you, and I don't know if it makes sense, is to route issues that are raised before the rent board, which he says can be costly to operate, first through mediation, and then as a second step through arbitration before it comes to the board. And he says often if it goes through that route, it can be resolved and the cost absorbed through the court system or mediation arbitration process and not show up essentially on the docket of a rent board cost. I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so we do have mediation. So basically the idea here is that overall, the overarching takeaway for me is that, and this will be no surprise to anyone here, if landlords and tenants talk to each other, most things can be resolved. I would say, and this is as a tenant advocate, most landlords are fairly reasonable people, right? Most tenants are reasonable people. Some tenants are destructive and do bad things, and some landlords are like aggressively, you know, cruel to their tenants. But most people are in the middle somewhere. And if a tenant says, like if I say to my landlord, as I did earlier this year, our screens are a little jacked up and some flies are coming in the screens. She sent someone out with the next week and fixed the screens. You know, that's how it should work. Some people don't have that experience, so they can file a petition, and the petition goes through a process where there has to be evidence. And sometimes once the landlord finds out there's even a petition, they realize, you know what, I should probably just fix the screens, you know, so then it's over at that point. Sometimes it goes to a pre-hearing conference where they sit down with the hearing officer. It's not a hearing, but they sit down with the hearing officer and they go through the evidence and they're like, do we understand what the issues are? Do we want to go forward with the hearing? And often either the tenant's like, you know, I misunderstood, or I realize now that landlord has been working on this and it just takes a little bit of time. Or the landlord says, you know what, I have been dragging my feet. Let me just get this done. Like I said, we haven't had any cases go actually to a hearing. And then it would only come to the board if they wanted to appeal the hearing officer's decision. Now, in terms of costs, we employ a senior hearing officer. So that is a cost to us, no matter how that person is being used. But you also can, in the smaller cities, they contract hearing officers that are not city employees that will be available to you on a as needed basis, which can be a cost savings. We also on an as-needed basis, employ the Loyola Center for Conflict Resolution, who we've had some success with. Now, I don't know, when I say success, I don't know the parties involved as a rent board member, and I don't know what the outcome was. That's the private between the parties. So when I say success, it just means that the two came to some kind of agreement. And I don't know if the tenant felt they had to cave in or what, but I assume that if they wanted to press it, they would have, you know? So, and that kind of also brings me to one other point I wanted to mention, which is sometimes tenants feel like now that we have this rent regulations and a rent board and all the rest, we don't need to organize as much. But tenants are still at risk and tenants are still scared. They don't even want to bring a petition for anything because they're afraid their landlord can retaliate, even though the provisions say that, you know, retaliation is forbidden. So the organizing is still important, and the landlords in Pasadena are promising to run a 2026 ballot measure to repeal everything that we've done. So now we have to organize to do that. So keep organizing, and but I'm happy to talk more offline about the costs as well.
Okay.
I can show you our budget and all of that.
So we try to keep to our 1:30 promise as a final sign-off time. I once again want to say how grateful we are for your work, Ryan, in tenant advocacy and in Pasadena, to Anna for causes, amazing leadership over years in pushing forward the agenda of tenant protection and rent stabilization and housing in general, and to Rich Applebaum for the wisdom and understanding of how to frame the arguments that we may need to be making. Um, uh, I think the political climate is different now than it was 40 years ago when we tried to pass rent control here, because people do recognize the crisis. And we haven't even touched on all of the reasons for the crisis, like the enormous student housing market that is very threatening, really, to family and working people's rental situation, and a very exploitable market. So thanks to everyone here. I think SBCAN is going to try to build and maintain a list of people who are interested in this particular issue, maybe be able to be in keeping you in touch with what needs to be done as we go forward, and what the progress is part of what we in SBCAN will be trying to help with doing. So, and hope that you guys, anyone who's here today for this issue, will want to make a habit of attending our roundtables if you haven't been in the past. Thank you all once again. And any feedback you have, or further questions, please send them to the SBCAN email address, and will be wonderful to hear from anybody. Thanks again, Ryan, Anna, and Rich, and all the rest of you. Take care, carry forward, keep our chins above water.
Thank you,
Everybody,
everyone.
thank you
Good
so
job.
much.
Thank
Good
you.
job.
This was fun. Bye-bye.